So I say, yeah, so housekeeping, just any comments or chat, questions you may have, please pop them in the chat. Joining me, we have obviously Debbie who's our regional program lead from South East ADASS. We have Gerald Wistow from London School of Economics, Richard Smith and Claire Maynard, which is the Corporate Director of Kent County Council, and Claire is the Strategic Commissioner in Kent, and we're also joined by Adam Hutchinson, who's the Managing Director of Belmont Healthcare and the Vice Chair of the Kent Integrated Care Alliance. So what we're going to cover, so we're going to, I'll try and keep my introduction fairly brief. We'll move on to Gerald, who will then talk us through the research and evidence base of some of the data that sits behind our self-funded care market. We'll hear from Richard and Claire, who will talk through the sort of challenge from a council perspective from Kent County Council. And then we'll move on to the Adam, who will talk us through the impact of self-funders through the lens of a care provider. So that's what we'll cover, and there'll be sort of 15 minutes or so for discussion and Q&A at the end. So if you can think of some, as we're running through, some questions or comment or any discussion you'd like us to have, that'd be really helpful to run through that for the last 15 minutes. So just a bit about the South East region. As you can see, we stretch all the way from sort of Oxfordshire at the top left to Kent, to the sort of bottom right, and then all the way down to the Isle of Wight. So we do stretch quite a large region. We're made up of 19 councils. We have 6 county councils, 2 unitary counties, 10 unitary authorities, plus the states of Jersey. And I think once lockdown's over and we're able to do meetings in person, I think we all need to do our branch meetings out in Jersey. I think that's my plan for moving forward. So we can have a bit of time on the beach as well as seeing each other. Obviously, mix of size and demographics, as you can tell from the scale of the big county councils to some of the smaller unitaries, but obviously facing considerable pressures like everybody else across the country. Relative prosperity of the region, but we've got low proportion of people in long-term unemployment compared to the national average, but obviously we have increasing pressures in terms of demand with some of the counties, particularly counties across the region, having proportions of older people above 85 in their populations much higher compared to the national average. And obviously our the reason we're talking to you today is obviously we have a high number of self-funders in the region, which obviously pose a particular opportunity and challenge for us, particularly as over time those people possibly, or most of them, will move on to needing funding from the council as their personal funding runs out. And in a sense, that challenge we have is that for some parts of the region, that self-funded market is a very high percentage of impact across the council areas, and for others it's a much smaller number. So we're ranging from something like 70% of impact to 10% of impact overall. In terms of the sort of value of the market we're talking about, obviously the adult social care market estimated sort of last year was contributed 41.2 million per annum to the economy. And the South East region contributes about 6.8 billion of that overall. The South East has the highest number of active care homes. We have nearly 3,000 care homes in the region, so with the highest number of care homes, and we have the second highest number of active registered domiciliary care agencies, just behind London in terms of those agencies, but a similar workforce overall. And I suppose in recognising that, we sort of moved into a situation where we wanted to have a bit more of an understanding of the market across the South East, having a look at what the impact of the pandemic was happening for us. So we commissioned the London School of Economics to do a care market project for us in understanding sort of understanding the size and structure of the care market. And a sub-regional breakdown. So we looked at the distinctive character and complexity of the care market in relation to the diversity provision in the region, including the scale of businesses and their ownership, looking at self-funders, obviously that's the focus of today, PAs, direct payments, and the council market share. And each each council in the South East took part, and we particularly wanted to have, as I say, a look at that through the lens of the challenges and changes that were occurring due to COVID-19, and what potential there was for sort of commissioning opportunities and opportunities for shaping the care market for the future. We looked at lots of data, used the capacity tracker and the statutory terms, etc., to help us with that piece of work, and resulted in a report. And the data from that report has been used to shape today's workshop. And each council got a bespoke report, but there is a Southeast region report overall. So rather than, I suppose that rather than me sort of talk through a lot of the data from that Gerald will pick that up in a few minutes. So the workshop itself will be a walk through the challenges in the Southeast region as a consequence of the care market, predominantly funded by people paying for their own care. A look at the research from London School of Economics, and as the sort of look at the financial challenges and the dynamic that self-funder market introduces, together with some sort of changes that the pandemic has brought. And I suppose that the fundamental question, probably for us all as we think through this, and you'll get a flavour of that from Kent and from a care provider in Kent, is obviously the impact of the pandemic. With demand for a range of services from the self-funder market, where does that leave us in terms of a viability and sustainability for some of the care market across, well, in our region particularly, but obviously across the country. So I'm going to pause there and hand over to Gerald. I then need to come off of screen share and hand over to Gerald Wistow from London School of Economics. Thank you, Gerald.
Okay. I'm waiting for your slide to go, is that right?
Yeah, has it not gone yet?
No.
It should have gone.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Now waiting for mine to come up. There we are. I'll just put it on slide. Okay, I hope everyone can see that.
Yep, can do.
That's okay, great. Okay, well, thanks for the introduction. I'm making this presentation on behalf of the three of us who did the work for Southeast ADASS, and the project was led by our director, Jose Luis Fernandez, and supported by myself and Francis Dickinson. And what I want to do first of all is just say a few words about how we actually went about delivering what Southeast ADASS had asked us to do. We used a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods, and in terms of the quantitative work, we used publicly available statistical data to describe the social care system in each authority and to compare it with the other Southeast councils and with England as a whole. And as Alan said, each authority has received a bespoke report on the situation in their own local care market. And we, having produced those reports, then used those reports as the framework for qualitative interviews, in which we met with often the directors and always with people with a strategic responsibility for commissioning. The interviews varied from 1 person to 11, and I guess that the mean was about 3 or 4. It's important to say that we conducted these interviews in September and October of 2020, and therefore, when we were asking questions about COVID, it was very much about the experience of the first wave, and we don't have information about how that experience has changed. It may be that colleagues from the Southeast will want to talk about that during the discussion. We delivered a draft report to a regional workshop in November, and taking on board comments that were made in that, we delivered a final report in December. Now, the presentation draws on sections of the report, only sections of the report, and it's obviously focused on the whole issue of self-payers, but we thought it was important because the way in which you describe these kinds of issues really sort of determines how you think about them. If you think about direct payers, you think about it really from the point of view of the people who are the consumers in the market. If you think about it in terms of the market as a whole and the market shares, then you begin to think about the respective roles of different people who have a purchasing role within the overall care market. And we use this term mixed purchasing just as a reminder that just as we have a mixed economy of provision, we also have very much a mixed economy of purchasers of care, including in the care market, including the NHS, and that is obviously an element of the market that's become even more important generally and with respect to self-purchases in recent months. So just a couple of further points about South East authorities. I think we were very conscious that there's a kind of stereotype of the South East as being a pretty well-heeled part of the country, and that it has an above average proportion of over 85s, and that just as it is relatively wealthier, then so the actual levels of deprivation are relatively less. Now, there's some truth in all of that, but what we want to emphasize is the variations between authorities in the Southeast, and also, even more so, the variations within authorities. And when you look at our data, you'll see that that comes out very clearly. But just to pick out three elements, the first is that the proportion of over 85s actually spans the full distribution across English authorities, from Slough, which has a very low population, to Sussex, that is among the highest proportion in the countries. Equally, it is true, of course, that authorities in the Southeast are relatively wealthier, and as a very clear expression of that, 7 of the 10 authorities that have the lowest proportion of older people receiving pension credit are in the Southeast. But at the same time, 5 of the Southeast authorities are in the top half of the distribution, not towards the very top, but nonetheless, again, there's a wide spread. And also, with the proportion of the population receiving statutory social care, 6 of the bottom 10 authorities, the lowest numbers of the lowest proportion of the population receiving statutory social care, are in the Southeast. But again, 5 are in the top half. So there is a much wider distribution of experiences within the Southeast than is sometimes recognised. And as I've already said, the distribution within authorities is quite substantial as well. I want to talk now about the situation pre-COVID. The local authority is the biggest single purchaser in the market in each area, in the main, but not exclusively. But self-funders may have the largest market share, and they of course have significant consequences for the LA local authority and NHS funded markets. The range in terms of the host market's share is estimated at between 10 and 70%, but typically it's around 25 to 30, with the majority of the remainder being self-funders. But both the NHS and also other local authorities, other than the host local authority, also have market shares which vary quite considerably between authorities and between different parts of authorities. The extent to which local authorities were found to be proactively seeking to exercise influence over the whole market is, perhaps not surprisingly affected by the extent to which they have, by the size of their market share, but also the extent to which they give priority to a market shaping, market oversight role. And as we know, that role was set out in the Care Act of 2014, but it's been pretty well underdeveloped across the country as a whole. Before the pandemic, there were variations in the extent and regularity of communication between providers and local authorities. But in the case of local authorities and their non-contracted providers, there was little or no communication in general. Again, some variations, but in the main, really very little communication between those with whom you don't contract and those with whom you do, not surprisingly. But some authorities had developed partnerships with providers, and they developed incentives for providers to come in and help fill in gaps in supply, whether those are of a geographical kind or in terms of types of care. And some of those incentives were land, long-term contracts for nursing, dementia care, and also for extra housing. The challenges from self-funding are pretty well known, and I just draw your attention particularly to the list at the bottom here. Things like capital depletion adding to the cost burden, issues about the development of a supply of services that may be contrary to the care models in the authority's commissioning strategy and which create rather than manage demand. Also issues about the impact of a big provider of a big market for self-funders on sustaining workforce recruitment and retention. So what happened when COVID hit? And this, as I said at the beginning, is very much about the wave one. The first thing is that, of course, local authorities actually had real market-wide responsibilities, and that led to the strengthening of relationships with providers, including those that they didn't previously contract with. So those were those sorts of providers benefited particularly from regular contacts and information sharing. We had a lot of reports of providers being appreciative of a rapid response to queries from the local authority when they were unable to get guidance from other sources. Local authorities also provided significant financial support to providers, including some that they might not have contracted with before. They helped to distribute the they did distribute the infection control monies. They helped with the PPE, sometimes paying for voids. There were also a larger number of NHS placements, normally paying a higher fee, and they were an important source of support to providers. And there was improved market intelligence, but primarily used to review the situation of individual providers rather than a systems level analysis or modelling. The overall impact of this was that in the first wave, the levels of supply were generally sustained, and trusting relationships were said to have been developed between commissioners and providers. Commissioners thought that local authority support to providers had demonstrated their ability to engage with and deliver practical support across the care market as a whole. So that from which they commissioned, and also the care market for self-funders. They thought that the support had improved the confidence of home managers in handling the pandemic, and also reinforced understandings and perceptions of local government as a potentially positive influence. The trust in local authorities, which they reported developing, also grew out of the local authorities' ability to help mediate what was sometimes seemed to be poorly informed pressures from the centre and from NHS leaders, and both of whom thought that providers could be given direct instructions and were part of, sometimes almost as if they were part of a hierarchical organisation. And in summary, the commissioner-provider relationships were demonstrated to be a two-way street. There were mutual benefits to both the local authority, to the NHS, and to the self-funder markets. So looking forward, final slide, a market-wide management and oversight role was outlined in the Care Act, as I mentioned. It's been underdeveloped, but its contribution may be particularly significant in localities with larger self-funded markets. But actually, it's relevant to the market as a whole. It's relevant to whole systems working more generally. The developments that reported here arose from a particular combination of circumstances and at a point of crisis. They weren't systematically planned or anticipated, and that immediately raises questions about whether they will be sustained, whether they can be sustained, whether they depended upon the crisis to enable them to go forward. If they are to be sustained, we would suggest that the infrastructures and incentives for market development and oversight need to be proactively developed. You can't allow them to develop by happenstance. We need to learn from the way in which the system operated during the crisis with a view to securing benefits for commissioners and providers into the future. The consequences of subsequent waves of the pandemic, as I've said, need to be taken into account at this point. And equally, the integration and innovation white paper, its implications for a market-wide oversight role, and the balance between central and local responsibilities and authority will also need to be understood and taken into account. And locally, we suggested that a useful starting point could be the continuing development of understandings of the impact of self-payers and NHS purchasing on care market structures and outcomes, so that local authorities can have a stronger base and a sustainable base for taking a view across the market as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. That was really helpful summary of the work that was undertaken by LSE. So we're going to move on to a conversation with Kent County Council. So I'm going to introduce you to Richard and Claire. So Richard and Claire, can I hand over to you? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Alan, and thank you for inviting Kent County Council to do a quick rattle through, and it will be very quick because I don't want to eat into Adam's time, who can tell us what it's like at the sharp end, really. So I'm Richard Smith. I'm the Corporate Director for Adult Social Care in Kent County Council. With that comes the role of the Director of Social Services, and I'm joined by Claire Maynard, who's the Strategic Commissioner for Kent County Council. And for those of you who don't know much about Kent, can I have the next slide, please, Claire? Is that I've been in Kent as a corporate director for just over 12 months now, so fairly new to Kent, and boy, it takes a bit of getting used to. The sheer size of Kent, in a sense of, I guess I'm famed for some of my Wikipedia facts. I think it's slightly larger than Estonia, and from one end to the other, I think it's over 100 miles. So it is a large landmass. It's 2% of the landmass of the country. We do have a significant number of care homes. We have 546 care homes. Some of those care homes we have contractual arrangements with, and I guess as we move through this conversation, there's some of those care homes we've strengthened our relationships with that we previously didn't have relationships with, in the event how we were requested to distribute some of the infection control grant. So on the right hand side of the slide there is just the size and complexity of the marketplace. As a rough indication, our bed bases are split a third, a third, a third. Pretty much the local authority commissions a third, the CCG commission another third, and you know, the people who fund their own market for their own care fund another third of the market. So it's a significant chunk of the care market. We have a wide range of care providers. We have big national and international providers with 100 to 120 beds, to very small local businesses with 10 to 15 beds in residential homes. So very diverse. We've almost in the county council got a region in itself. So it's an interesting space to be, and it's certainly going to be impacting. The pandemic has certainly impacted about how we work with our providers. So there's just some scale of the size of Kent for our conversation. If I just hand on to Claire now, can go into some of the detailed stats and numbers briefly, and then we can get into the presentation from one of our care providers.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Claire.
So the context in terms of what's that changing landscape in the last 12 months, and the context of that third. So this is, you see, our placement since February last year, and I'm sure this is really familiar to all of you in terms of that sort of downward trajectory. We lost significant numbers of clients in spring last year. It was starting to recover in the autumn, only to drop again in December, and we're still not seeing that return back to normal, for want of a better expression, of people in residential care. And in the context of that third, it was a greater impact in our self-funders. Self-funders are more reticent still to return back to residential care. And in terms of health placements, providers were reticent about accepting health placements, certainly early on in the pandemic, in terms of what they were bringing into their homes. So that's the kind of the context of where we are. And in terms of the occupancy rates, as Richard said, last year we were 88% occupancy. We're now down on average 10%, and that does vary across the county, across the region. And occupancy rates are built into providers' business model. They need to have the minimum level to be sustainable. And there's also an absolute recognition that our private clients will pay more than the local authority, and certainly health will pay more than us. So in terms of the scheme of importance, we were kind of the ones who pay the least. And in the context of having an increasing number of former self-funders coming to the local authority, all of that has a significant impact on our providers and their cash flow and their business models. So I want to hand over to Adam now to talk about what it means to him in reality as a provider.
Thank you, Claire. So welcome, Adam.
Hi there.
Debbie, are you going to try sharing Adam's slides? And if you can't, then just let me know.
Yeah,
I'll pop those up.
The slides goes into kind of like a post-COVID view, but I think it's interesting with some of the pre-COVID stuff that's just been mentioned, and some key points that have already been raised, certainly by what Claire said at the end there from a provider perspective. I won't sort of waste any of the time with any intros, but from a key operator perspective, focusing on the southeast, I think you're all probably aware that private funding is a key driver of people's decision making in terms of care delivery in the southeast. There's a lot of analytical data which is now used from an operator perspective. We're making decisions on whether that's to acquire a new care home or keep care homes open, or indeed the super prime asset market which is out there, which is your 60+ new build developments, which are very much focused around a near 70 to 80% private fee model. One of the interesting stats that's been come out recently is that there is an expectation, and this was put out there by Carter Woods and Knight Frank, which are two of the biggest sort of data analytical players in our sort of market space, is around the fact that the occupancy recovery rates, which Claire sort of went into, we may not see some of that come back until sort of the summer of 22. So people such as Barchester and HC1, some of the larger providers in the market, saw up to 24% decrease in occupancy, wave 1 and wave 2, which obviously has had major impact on people's business models, which was a nice segue, Claire. It's amazing we didn't actually speak about each of the presentation, but you've cut nicely into that. Is that I suppose it's having a clear understanding of the differentials in understanding for a private operator's business model. Is there is an access into local authority funded clients, but they are seen as, look, I'm being very blunt in the wording that I've used, but they are seen as sort of block booking contracts. So it's about the fact that there is a constant flow of referrals rather than an individual contract arrangement that you have with private funded individuals. And obviously there's a lot of marketing spend that goes into individual clients, whereas if you have a contract relationship with a local authority, it obviously that impact doesn't come. So that's probably an unspoken phrase sometimes, but that's where the fee differentials tend to come in, because you do have a guaranteed flow of referrals, which goes back to, it's very important that individuals in the services is what fund the operators to keep going, and there has to be a focus to make sure that the operators don't fail, which is the biggest concern in the market, because we're starting to see, certainly in the private market, what I've put in the middle of that slide there, this contemporary versus luxury market stock. So there are the operators out there that are building new developments, and they are very, very focused heavily on the private market, which will impact the local authorities substantially, because we've seen it in certain high wealth, let's call it, areas, because one of the key focuses in an operator's demographics will be looking at house prices. In areas, Kent is a prime example, such as Tunbridge Wells has extremely high house prices. It also has difficult with recruitment in terms of numbers of staffing available, but you'll find that there may be an impact on private funders going into homes, and then when they convert down to needing to be funded by the local authority, there becomes a challenge in terms of how that person is therefore funded at a rate which is substantially above the requirement of a local authority contracting. But I've put that column there that says post-COVID is one of the things that we've seen as an operator individually, but also as Kicker, we represent over 10,000 of those beds now in Kent. And we have seen a real shift in services in terms of de-risking, because people are seeing that the reluctance in the private market availability. The media narrative has been extremely unhelpful. I feel that, there has been a focus on embedding that COVID is incubated in a care home, which obviously it certainly isn't. But there is a scare. But also, I think the interesting part is the capacity. Is because we've got a lot more working from home and people who are furloughed. They're saying that there's near to 3 million people that have much more accessibility to look after loved ones in their own home or in their own space, or as part of the family unit. So what I think that what I'm definitely seeing is a shift in the focus in terms of what operators are looking for. You're starting to see that top 20% of super prime asset class really focusing heavily on the private market and being very strong in that fees. But then as we start to come down to say more the older assets, people are trying to focus on much more complex needs, high needs dementia, CCG funding, to try and fill that gap, of which they had, Claire was very open and honest about the differential in fee base, and trying to focus on the higher fees by focusing more on a more complex needs basis. So that's certainly where the private market is starting to change, but it also means that there has to be an improved and a much better, more transparent working relationship with the local authorities, and we're certainly seeing that happen in Kent, and East Sussex is another area that I'm involved in. I mean, if you wanted to flick on to the next slide, sorry, I've got control of them. You might, yeah. So this is kind of just covering some of the bases. There has been a lot of changing business models in that. Where quick decisions have had to be made, and operators being dynamic and having a better dialogue with local authorities to very much be more transparent about the differentials in terms of how do we maintain certain providers in the market and ensure there isn't market failure as the demand, because while it's at the moment sort of low, the predictions will see that confidence will come back. And what we don't want to see is, as a market, as we all know, still 60 to 65% of the market is still what they call contemporary operators, ones and twos ownerships. if they start to make the decision to retire or leave the market, what is going to happen to the availability should it increase? These are some of the concerns that are coming out of the private market to make sure that they continue to operate and we don't see failure. One of the shifts certainly in the private market, in the private pay space, has been that was very much down the lower need end. So you're finding that sort of more lower need residential companionship type space, of which that is very, very much being accommodated at home. Therefore, again, there is another part of the market that's sort of falling away. But also, I think you're seeing that in a lot of market position statements from local authorities, that's also the driver. So I think there has to be this level of understanding. We need to be very clear on the criteria of what the expectation of who's going to go into a care home and then how that is therefore funded. Personal opinion and a kind of a group opinion by a number of operators that I work with is that potentially the value of fee will increase, but actually the volume of people that are being cared for in those sort of more residential environments will probably decrease due to the ability to be able to care for them elsewhere, which is essentially the next slide for, I think I've just covered it before the slides come up, but yeah, just potentials to what the market engagement to sort of private supply looks like is, improvement, development relationships between health and social care. Big believer that if we got that belts and braced before wave 2, before Christmas of this year, I think we would have helped the NHS a lot more if we could have taken a lot of people who were essentially bed blocking. There's certainly space and capacity around sort of referral processes and bed management. And I know a lot of operators and local authorities trying to work together more to find a better way to improve that patient throughput and flow from going from one service to another, which will enable, help support occupancy issues that we're facing in the sector, but then also patch up some of the income deficits. And yeah, that's kind of what I've covered there. I've tried to be, that was a very whistle-stop tour, but I'm open to a bit more discussion, but hopefully that's covered the basis.
Thank you, Adam. That was really helpful summary. Can I just check that I've stopped screen sharing?
Yes.
And that it's gone, because sometimes you can't tell, can you, when you're looking at Teams as to whether it's still up, the presentation is still up on the screen or not, or whether it's even there at all. So thank you everybody. Thank you Gerald, thank you Claire and Richard, and thank you Adam for your summaries. Just in terms of any questions or comments, I can see we've got one comment that's come through on the chat. So should we start with that one, and then colleagues can then either pop their hands up or add to the chat. So Helen, you've said interesting insights. Our commissioners locally joined up between health and social care. So that's probably, maybe I'll go to Claire and Richard, and then Adam can give a view from his point of view.
Do you want me to start, Richard?
Yeah, you go first.
Yeah. So at the start of COVID, I would say we weren't really that joined up, but certainly there's been a significant improvement in how we're working together, and we've tried different ways of buying beds together, looking at focusing on getting people out of hospital. And I think we've learned just as much from what didn't go well as for what has gone well. So we're now at the point where we are looking to have a joint bed brokerage model and looking at joint contracting where possible. Which is the point of having a third and a third between us. We've got an absolute role there to try and shape and address all those concerns that Adam had together. So long-winded way of saying, yes, we are now absolutely joined up.
I think very familiar in Hertfordshire where we are, the working together that during COVID has really built that understanding. So it feels very familiar, the challenge that's been set out.
I think
it's definitely more so because of it. Sorry to interrupt, Richard. I didn't know you was going. That's the problem with this.
Sorry, Adam. It's the team's etiquette, isn't it? Sorry.
I know. Yeah, we should do the hand. It's my fault. Yeah, I think definitely because of it. I think I did actually put it in the last slide, and I will give some kudos here. I work across a number of local authorities, and there has, and everyone works so very differently, which I'm being honest as an operator is frustrating, is that there's no blanket sort of approach to it, but Kent have been extremely supportive. I think we'd started the seeds of that leading into it, and the pandemic has really helped sort of, which is strange to say, has really helped improve some of those, but that hasn't happened as across the board. It's been very specific to I think teams wanting to do that, but I think the ultimate challenge is accepting that the market is heavily provisioned by a private market, and therefore there has to be that true engagement into them. Otherwise, the delivery is never going to quite work.
Thank you, Adam. Richard, was there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just reflecting on the narrative over the last sort of 12 months has changed, I think, between ourselves and our partners. And I guess what we're talking about is a language of partnerships and collaboration rather than contracting and procurement. And I think this is almost the conversation. COVID has been a massive team building exercise, I think, for us, that we have actually, and I guess it's also demonstrated again that, you know, sometimes it's better to leave local leaders and local organisations to resolve local problems rather than a national sort of intervention into that space, because sometimes that can't be helpful. And I think we're all going through some of the challenges, aren't we, of the bringing forward of the ICSs into a statutory body and what the commissioning landscape will look like. When we talk about, you know, commissioning will be done at an ICP, 80% at an ICP level. So I think it's a really interesting time, I have to say, about the relationships and partnerships that we formed.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I suppose just an additional comment from me, Helen, was I think there are parts of the country and there's parts of the southeast where the councils purchase the care provision on behalf of the local NHS and the local CCG, and I think where that happens, you've got an opportunity to try and have a one approach to working with providers, which I think is really helpful, as Adam was indicating there, the different approaches we all have, but also that bit about some sort of agreement on the sort of price we're going to be paying, so you don't get a distorted purchase from the NHS into a local care market, which I know at times causes us all, including providers, an interesting time, I think. Yeah, thank you, Helen, for your question. Rob, you had your hand up, then you dropped it.
Yeah, I'm yo-yoing. I keep putting it up and down, but if I can, I will just comment quickly. It's been said already to an extent, but I think there is a kind of an improving but still an inconsistent picture about kind of the interface between health and certain local authorities. So we have made strides, but I think to support the provider market, there is still more mileage for us to work better with our NHS colleagues, so that we can, so that interface then with providers is a more consistent and understood relationship. The other point I just wanted to make was, which I think we missed on this one so far, is around the quality of the referrals and admissions of the information that providers get for admissions into care homes, both from the community and from hospital settings. So for me, what I've seen in the last year in Brighton Hove is some inconsistency where it's been better flow of information about the person going to the care home, be they self-funder or local authority funded, from a community than it has been from the NHS. So I do think there's something about supporting providers with a better pathway, so they know exactly what kind of person they're accepting, and that the person that arrives in the care home is actually what they've been told they're going to get. Because there have been some instances where we've had some relatively poor admissions into care homes, which have then broken down very quickly. So I think there's a qualitative element that we need to address, both in the self-funder and the local authority market going forward as well.
And Rob, do you think that's a particular issue for self-funders, but people who are self-funding coming directly out of hospital? Is that your experience? And perhaps we'll bring Adam in just to get a reflection from him in a second.
I don't know if this is very much a Brighton Hove experience, and I would stress in saying this is not. I'm not saying this is the norm, but there are certain times where, because there have been breakdowns in relationships between the wards and care homes. So from where we were 6 years ago, care homes don't seem to have don't seem to have the same relationships now that they had 6 years ago with hospitals. So they then get presented with somebody coming out who's not quite the person they expected to see. And I think there's just work, whether it's irrespective, whether it's self-funded or not, there's work to make sure that quality of pathway on discharge is improved. And I think it is a particular issue for self-funders as well, actually, because we have less to do with those self-funders, to be honest.
Okay, so yeah, thanks, Rob. Adam.
Yeah, it was just picking up. I absolutely agree with that. I mean, it's fundamental that cog of social and health works, because actually the amount of people that are using both services is can be in 90% of times, and there needs to be a much better route. And I know we've always been talking about it, seems to be the thing that's never going to get sorted. But one of the things I wanted to make on this around not so much attention to self-funders, sometimes it's forgotten, and even operator side forget this, that a lot of self-funders go through the local authority mechanism, because some people don't realise at the time of placement that they are self-funding, because there's no financial assessment done if somebody's in hospital or it's an emergency placement. They don't know whether they've got the availability of funds or they're over the threshold. And I would say, as a business ourselves, nearly 35% of the intake that we take of self-funders will come from actual local authority referrals. But by the time we work it out, oh yes, there is money there, or the family don't realise the system. So sometimes it's missed by people because it's just not on the radar, because you're trying to place that person in the right place at a crisis. So actually, it is very important that sometimes I think it's forgotten that the self-funders are touching the local authority system and the CCG system a lot more often than we know, especially now the cases are more complex, because they are coming from mental health support unit or a CCG or a hospital or something, or a recovery unit or hospice, rather than making the decision themselves from their own home. That is really quite rare, certainly in the last 18 months. And we started to see some of that pre-COVID as well.
Thank you, Adam. Really helpful response. Anybody else got any further questions or comments, or anything they'd like to raise as a discussion point? So I've got a question for Adam from Debbie. Debbie, do you want to ask your question rather than me reading it out in the chat?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so it's just a question, really, Adam. So thinking about the grant funding which is being made available from the Department of Health and Social Care over the last 12 months or so, but paid via local authorities, do you think the relationships with care providers who have little reliance on councils for funding would have developed in quite the same way had the funding come direct from the Department of Health and Social Care?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think it's helped enable conversation. I think Richard mentioned it earlier. I think it's enabled conversations to happen with providers that might not have normally been there. Yes. So I think it's acted as a facilitator. And I definitely think it needed to be handled locally, because it helps the provider market understanding, because it is very different. And I think if it was, I mean, DHSE have had pretty much, I've been doing this for nearly 10 years, and this is the only real time I've dealt with the Department of Health and Social Care. Because of the pandemic, it's always been either CCG or local authority, but not that in the way in which it's disseminated. So I think that would have been very green, and it probably wouldn't have worked. I think it did need the intervention. But I couldn't. Yeah, I think it needed to work in that way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Thank you. Rob, you got your hand up again.
Yeah, so I can just ask another question. I hope you don't mind me asking this one. I think we've had this conversation at ADASS South East recently, and maybe I'm slightly out on a limb on this one. We struggle sometimes as a local authority to understand self-funders when their assets are reducing, when they're likely to be coming our way. And my sense is that often the providers will have a better understanding of what the financial position is of individuals than actually local authorities, because they won't have been to the local authority. And I do wonder whether there is something in the space for us working together more and more cohesively going forward. In us understanding, we need to understand really clearly what the self-funded picture is for us, as far as how many are likely to become reduced assets over a year and come our way. If we could get a better notice of that, let's say a year notice of people who may be coming through, then we can actually plan with providers better how to do those transitions, because obviously we never want to actually move people, because that's the worst thing you want to do for people. But sometimes local policies get the pressures about kind of, if it's 1,500 quid in one place now, framework rate is 800, then should we be moving them? And that leads to all sorts of complications with the families, with the politicians, etc. So I do think there is something about planning forward as to whether we can improve that interface and that sharing of intelligence around when self-funds are going to reduce asset.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So I'm going to before I bring Adam in on that, just Gerald, was there anything in terms of the research that London School of Economics did in conversations with councils where councils were doing this well, or anything that sort of cropped up in those conversations?
That doing this well in relation to understanding the demands that private payers might be making in the longer term.
That's correct.
Yeah. I'd need to go back and check. My memory is that there were a couple of places, I'm not sure if Surrey was one, but there were a couple of places where we felt that the information that people had about self-funders was more complete than others. I don't know what the situation in Kent is. I know that Jose Luis came along and talked to you and had a really good conversation in Kent. What sort of information base do you have?
I think it's patchy given the size of Kent, and I think, I mean, I guess a lot of the situation is arisen as about, you know, that how well informed people are at that first point of contact with the health system, whether it be the health system or whether it be the local authority system, is that about the sharing of information and the consistent amount of information that's provided. And I think it's patchy. I think it's not based on a strategic or a policy view. I think it's about how informed and proactive those practitioners, whether it be health practitioners or social care practitioners, are in those conversations in the hospital or in the community setting. So I think there's also something nagging at the back of my head. There must be a digital answer to this question, and I think it's an exam question we can set ourselves around a digital response to this.
But I mean, if you look at information from another study that we've done, which is about people's knowledge of how the service is funded and what that means for them should they require services, there is still a very large majority of people who think that social care is available on the same terms as the NHS, and it's a big surprise when they find that it's means tested and that they may become self-payers.
Yeah, thank you, Gerard. Adam, was there anything else you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, it's an education piece. We've talked about this, Claire and I. It's because it's difficult for us to ask the families financial information because it feels very intrusive, but it's also sometimes not. They don't want to open up to the authorities until money runs out. But it is a massive headache. The admin time that goes on in Kent around this, where it ends up being backdated because actually it was 4 months ago, and then it's all admin and refunds, and it's more of an education piece to make the I believe about how both sides, operators and local authorities, work on educating families that as you enter care, by the way, this is where you're going to go. Okay, I think this is why when they talked about the green paper a few years ago about saying about where a lot more people would go through the system, whether they were funded or not, helps create the awareness. We do our best to try and find out, but a lot of the time, people don't want to do financial assessments with us. They don't want us checking their bank accounts and asking for that type of intrusive data. And we have to be careful under GDPR. But it's about, I think, a very, very open dialogue about this is what could happen. So do you understand it? A lot of people are a lot more open with their FAQs, and the CMA report that was done, obviously the changes in 2019, I think have really helped with that. We tend to try and guide people to that, say, look, do you understand what you're getting yourself into? This is where you need to be if it's this level. I think it just needs to be, I think the education piece comes first, and that will help, I think, probably 50% of the problem.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. And we've got a couple of interesting people having to disappear off to the meeting. There's always at 5 o'clock. There's always another meeting to go to on the hour, isn't there? But I think Richard's comment, and I'm probably going to draw us to a close because it's a sort of minute to go. And I think Richard's comment around the elephant in the room as the current business model for care doesn't stack up is probably an interesting place to stop, Richard, in a sense, isn't it? Because I think what I'm hearing is we've got obviously a major challenge in terms of supply and demand that we don't know how long that's going to go on for in relation to private fee payers and people who fund their own care, and that opportunity that I think we probably could have gone on to if we'd had a bit longer about changes of care models in terms of that supply and demand, and then how does that fit in relation to business models going forward. Obviously, it all comes back to money in the end, doesn't it? But I suppose the last thought from my point of view is probably that information and advice that we need to get better at providing to self-funders so they understand what it means to enter the social care setting when you need a social care service, and the complications around your own personal finances in relation to that. So I'm going to close us there. Thank you very much, everybody. So thank you for those who've attended. Thank you very much for our contributors. So thank you for Gerald, Claire, Richard, and Adam. So we'll close now. And just a reminder to everybody who's going on to the next session at 5 o'clock. There's a virtual meet and greet for ADASS members to meet new members and to meet old colleagues at 5 o'clock. So that's dropping off for this one and then joining on a different chat. So thank you, colleagues, and we'll close there. Thanks very much.